This is On Hand. I'm executive producer Laura Weber Davis. On the last episode of On Hand, we looked at the factors that make Michigan a craft beer powerhouse. We also talked about the influence of Two Hearted Ale on craft beer lovers everywhere. Archaeologist and historian Mickey Lyons said Bell's Two Hearted Ale has had a big impact on the industry here.
I mean, in some ways, I think it's a perfect symbol of the craft beer renaissance in Michigan. You know, it's named after a river in the Upper Peninsula. It's that style of easy-to-drink, interesting beer that isn't just a light lager.
And that led a listener named Rory to email me.
My name is Rory McHarg. I live in Farmington Hills in Michigan, and I am a creative director, filmmaker, artist.
Rory has a real story about Two Hearted Ale. He became so interested in the artwork on the label, a painting of a trout, that he made a whole documentary about the art and artist, Ladislav Henke of Kalamazoo.
So I was born in New Zealand, and then when I was about 25, I moved to London, and then 5 years later, New York, and then a decade later, I ended up here in Detroit. When I first came to Michigan, I said, I'm an IPA drinker. Someone said, oh, you got to drink this Two Hearted. It's the best. And I couldn't find it. I keep looking in the supermarket. I was like, where on earth is this beer? And then someone said, oh, there's a trout on the label. And so that was kind of fascinating from the beginning. Once I tried it, I was like, man, why did they put a trout on a beer label? It's like a stinky fish. And that's when I was like, maybe we should find out that answer. And then that led me to finding Ladislav, the artist, and I found all of his work and his website. And I was like, this is like a treasure trove of like incredible naturalists, these just beautiful etchings. Like, he's a full artist. And the fact that his trout has made its way to this beer, I was like, okay, I'll call him. I mean, I was just laughing so much when I first talked to him. It was probably an hour conversation. He was so eccentric. Everything he said was hilarious. He hated graphic design. He had no place for like commercial application of his work. And so me being a designer from a design background, it just made me think, oh man, I think this whole brand was just created off just a whim.
So I am known at this moment, at least around Kalamazoo, as the guy who did all these beer bottle labels over at Bell's.
If this brewery thinks enough of the product inside the glass to hire an artist to do the label, then this is worth trying.
Yeah, Ladislav he's a pure artist, very eccentric. He thinks of himself as more of a philosopher and a naturalist. He always said he's sort of a naturalist. So his artwork is like extremely biological in terms of like he's kind of just obsessed with nature. His dad was like a biologist, so I think that's where that fascination came as he grew up. My father was a fly fisherman as well in New Zealand, and so when I met Lad, not that they were the same in any way, there was just this we had this bond of fishing and understanding like kind of why men in particular go fishing and why they go fishing alone and why they live on these rivers and battle this trout. He read this book called Trout Madness that Robert Traver wrote, and his dad gave it to him, or he stole it from his dad, one of the two. And that was like his first foray into like drawing trout as anatomically correct as a kid. But he's so self-aware that the thing that made him semi-famous is a beer label, even though he spent, 50 years of his life being a fine artist.
What makes a good beer label? That's a hard one. I can come up with things that I know are good art. You're just there making these things and working with materials and letting something come through you. You're just going with it. And that's what most of us remember liking about being an artist.
Have you ever reflected on, there's like a cognitive dissonance about putting fine art on a beer bottle. And there is then also to me, a bit of a cognitive dissonance about making a documentary about a fine artist who puts their art on a beer bottle. Like how these,
Yeah.
like when I watch your trailer, I'm like, this is stunningly beautiful. An artist like this has no business making a thing about a beer bottle label. And then I look at the beer bottle and I'm like, that's stunningly beautiful. That beer has no business having fine art on it. Have you followed this natural trajectory in your brain as well?
Yeah, we did. I think the reason it was fascinating was because I was a big fan of Morris Sendak, and there was a documentary that Spike Jonze and Lance Bang did about Morris Sendak, which was really a portrait of him and how he sort of his process of getting to, where the wild things are. And I thought that was like so enthralling just to hear why these things are written. And so I was trying to take the same approach with this documentary. I was like, how can something as mundane as a beer label be experienced in such a profound way? And that's what we were trying to find. Like, why is he having this like profound experience with this beer label, and why do people just love it so much? And I was also in this place where it's like, do people just love the beer, or do they love the whole package? And that's what I was trying to explore. Like, do people associate the trout image with the beer and the name? And is that whole story a package? And do people even think about it? Because I think about it deeply for some silly reason.
What's your conclusion?
My conclusion was that people needed escapism. They need a story to be related to the product that they have in their hand that is a little bit different. We go into the supermarket or wherever to buy a beer. There's a million IPAs, right? And we choose something that speaks to us on the label artistically, so that maybe we can show our friends and we can share that illustration with our friends, and that drawing on the label speaks to our own sensibility, whether it's fashion or design or color or something like that. So I feel like that's what the revolution was. We need to be different. We can't just have a Budweiser label or a Miller Lite label, because it's just boring and there's no personality to it. Yeah, ultimately the film, I do think it was an exploration in looking at how artists can sustain themselves in a commercial world. And I think it was really important. We didn't really cover this in the film, but I think it's really important as more and more artists feel comfortable working with something like a brewery, opposed to working in the commercial landscape. But a beer company seems to be a place that artists feels comfortable putting their artwork on. And Ladislav's trout image has been reproduced somewhere over 1 billion times between labels and packaging and kegs and bar handles and the bottle top, and like this image is been reproduced more than any piece of art that he could ever imagine. People watch this film now go out and buy a different beer, a different craft beer at a different supermarket, and just think about what that label is, who made that label, who drew it, who painted it, what was their kind of concept around it, because it's it doesn't have to be in a gallery. It can just be on a product that you consume every day.
I don't know that it necessarily sells beer well, but I can make things that are quite beautiful and a lot of people seem to like, and I'm perfectly happy doing that.
Rory's documentary is called Two-Hearted Tale, and it's screening at the Fresh Coast Film Festival in Traverse City in May. Thanks to Rory for sending us his Two-Hearted Tale. And if you want to test your Michigan beer knowledge, check out our Michigan Beer Quiz at michiganpublic.org/onhand. And hey, while I have you, we have an episode coming up about the history of euchre, and we'd love to hear from you. Do you have feuds that have ensued over cards in your family? Have you held a euchre tournament? Or do you absolutely hate euchre and you prefer a different card game? Drop us a line. Same website, michiganpublic.org/onhand, or you can email us onhand@michiganpublic.org. Thanks so much for listening. Bye-bye.